Good morning, everyone. I think that Marianne seemed to be running late. And she was going to provide a few opening remarks, but I think in the aspect of time that we will get started with the presentation of the report. And then Marianne can join us for the following panel discussion. So Salam, if you could share the report. Yeah, so on the structure today, I will present some of the main findings of the report. And then I have two excellent panelists, Jana Elhor and Claudia Claudia Soto, and they will present projects that they're leading in Madagascar and Haiti. And after that, we will have a panel discussion. So thank you and welcome to today's talk. And I'm super excited to launch the report. It's called Gender Dynamics of Disaster Risk and Resilience. And I'm launching this obviously together with the co-authors, Sophie, Kainat, Stefan, and Mirai. I think they're all connected today. And this report has also benefited from inputs and guidance from Stefan Allegat, Maitre Das, and Kathleen Beagle, and also many more. So Salam, if you can go to the next slide. Before really getting started, I want to bring us back a bit to where this work started for us, at least. It was back a few years back when we were carrying out focus group discussions in flood-prone areas in Dar es Salaam. And we did this while we were doing a household survey there. And during these conversations, it was clear that women were taking a bigger responsibility in dealing with the consequences of flooding, and were also in certain ways hit harder than their husbands and male peers. And using the data, we were able to confirm a few things. One, that women were more likely to miss work after a flooding than men. We also found that women relied more heavily on community saving groups. And while they help women manage small shocks, the majority of these saving groups did not allow for payouts for flood damages, since this system of community saving groups would not work if everyone in the same area needed money at the same time. We also find that female-headed households, already a vulnerable group, were overrepresented in high-risk areas. Later, when I presented these results from the household service in Dar es Salaam, a woman who herself lived in a flood-prone area came up to me after the presentation. The woman lives with her two teenage daughters, and she said that due to the floods, she now has two grandchildren. She said that every time the house floods, the family must leave and usually end up living temporarily in separate households during the flood. During different occasions, this lack of parental supervision caused by the flooding resulted in her daughters coming back pregnant. So now she's responsible for 4 people instead of 2. I'm starting off these sessions with this anecdote for 2 reasons. One, we often hear things like women are more likely to die from disasters, women are more vulnerable to disasters, but there's been limited effort in identifying the drivers of disaster vulnerability that are also linked to gender dynamics. The experience in DAR got us thinking, what are the drivers of disaster, of gender differentiated impacts of disasters that we can identify and study? The second reason is that the woman's story illustrates the complexity of this issue. And of all the ways disasters affect people's lives, some of those impacts are easier to capture than others. And what you find in one place doesn't always apply in another. So I've started to touch upon why we're talking about this. The first reason is obvious. We know that there are differences in the way that men and women and boys and girls experience disasters. An improved understanding of the drivers can allow us to adapt policies and interventions in ways that mitigate the risk of disasters affecting one group in society disproportionately. Finally, it's not always women and girls who are worse off, and we need to use a nuanced approach when looking at this. There's a lot of interest on this topic and not as much evidence. And as a consequence, we see numerous policy and advocacy notes in circulation that repeats myths and stereotypes without much backing. So with this report, we hope to provide the DRM community with a clear sense of what we know and what we do not know when it comes to gender and disasters. Still, conclusions highlighted in this presentation and in the report are drawn from consolidated evidence of case studies from around the world. The more case studies and data we have, more confident we feel about results. But this report will not replace the need for local assessment. To understand the relationship between gender and disaster risk and resilience, we developed a non-linear framework. The orange circle represents disaster impacts. We look at disaster impacts broadly, from the traditional impacts such as asset and income losses to less traditional such as health and education outcomes, employment, consumption, and voice and agency. The impacts are a result of natural hazards. The natural hazards we cover in this, if you can go to the next one, Salam. The natural hazards we cover include flood, droughts, windstorms, earthquakes, etc. We don't cover epidemics or pandemics in this report since it's largely covered by the health literature already. But since we are in a pandemic right now, I can say that some of the results and findings obviously do inform the trends that we're seeing now and understanding the drivers of vulnerability of men and women in the current pandemic. But we haven't looked at it broadly. So natural hazards are gender neutral. This means that the wind of a cyclone, for example, will not be stronger just because there's a man or a woman in the way. Gender inequality, the purple circle that we see here, is a product of gender roles and discrimination in society. Gender inequality influences socioeconomic status, level of agency, behaviors, etc. In the area where gender inequality and disaster impacts overlap, we can find the factors determining disaster impacts that are also influenced by gender dynamics. These include exposure, which is who and what is at risk of being affected, levels of vulnerability, which is the susceptibility to damage once affected, and resilience, which is, per our definition, preparedness and coping capacity. It is in this overlapping area where gender differentiated impacts happen. These impacts of disasters can exacerbate gender inequality, which in turn can also worsen resilience to future disasters. And this is illustrated by the arrows going through the Venn diagram. And this is why policymakers have a responsibility to make sure that disasters are not disproportionately affecting a group in society. Disaster risk management should operate in this area. This means that good DRM should consider ways in which gender dynamics influence disaster impacts in any given area before making decisions on policy or project design. Now let's turn to results. The presentation follows the structure of the report. The first part focuses on disaster impacts as a result of gender gaps in exposure and vulnerability. The second part focuses on resilience as in preparedness and coping capacity. We will also discuss the data gaps in DRM, policy recommendations, and next steps. First section includes 4 areas of disaster impacts: health and mortality, education, child labor, economic outcomes, and voice and agency. A common question in the gender and disaster literature is whether more women or more men die in disasters. Included here is a very non-scientific comparison of studies that we looked at. They focus on different types of hazards and use different data sources. About half find that more women die and half find that more men die. When we look closer at these studies, it seems as though men are more likely to die from disasters in richer countries. And a review of flood events find that in Europe and the US, men account for 70% of deaths. A driver of this result is believed to be male overrepresentation in rescue work. In developing countries, women tend to be more likely to die, and socioeconomic status seem to be the main driver. In countries where women's socioeconomic status is lower, more women die in comparison to men from disasters. Next, please, just to take that out. We will discuss some of these socioeconomic drivers later on. So what about biology and biological factors? Being taller was a driving factor of lower mortality among men affected by the 2004 tsunami in Indonesia. However, before jumping to a conclusion, one needs to consider other factors that are much more difficult to control for, including the ability to climb and swim, which are learned skills, type of clothing potentially restricting movements, whether women are more likely to evacuate with children and elderly, and finally, potential differences in awareness of what to do in an emergency, where the shelter is, or hesitation to use public shelter because of safety concerns. We will talk more about this later in the discussion today. So these things are more important than physical differences. Other biological factors in the context of health is the role of women's reproductive and maternal health needs. These create unique post-disaster health impacts. For example, we saw increased rates of unplanned pregnancy after the earthquake in Haiti. And this was also the experience of the woman I met in Dar es Salaam. Perhaps surprisingly, there is a biological disadvantage of boys that make them more vulnerable to disaster impacts that happens in utero compared to girls. This was found in Japan due to a cold wave, in South Africa and India due to drought, and in Nicaragua after a hurricane. If the boys were unborn at the time of the disaster, they experienced worse long-term health outcomes than girls that were all unborn at the time. When the child is already born and the gender is known to parents when the disaster happens, girls tend to suffer more severe health consequences than boys. And this is due to preferred treatment of boys that we see in many places. So let's stay on the topic of children and education. So disasters influence school enrollment, and boys and girls are affected differently. When there's an increase in demand of labor due to the disaster, boys tend to be more affected than girls. Families affected by the cyclone Amy in Fiji were more likely to, the boys in those families were more likely to participate in farm work and less likely to go to school than non-affected families after the disaster. And the same effect was not observed for girls. When the disaster reduced the demand for labor, for example, after a drought, the opposite effect can be observed. A drought in Nicaragua in 2001 led to an increase in school enrollment among boys from smallholder families by 23%. When parents are unable to pay tuition due to a disaster, girls tend to suffer the consequences. Exposure to drought in Uganda and different hazards in Mexico resulted in a decrease in female school enrollment, but the decrease was not associated with an increase in child labor. So we see a bit of a different effect there. Where women and men depend on different sources of livelihood, they will also be affected differently from a disaster. Often women engage in sectors that are vulnerable to disaster impacts. For example, women in low and middle income countries depend more on agriculture than men. Their agriculture also tends to be more small scale and low on inputs, making it particularly vulnerable to drought. Women also face disadvantages on labor markets due to their often larger domestic burden, which tends to increase after a disaster. And this is what we're currently observing in the COVID crisis. And in Dar es Salaam, as mentioned earlier, we found that 60% of those that missed work due to flooding were women. We also find that due to exclusion from land and property ownership and lower access to bank accounts, women tend to hold a larger share of their assets in tangible form. This makes women's assets more exposed to natural disasters. For example, Let's look at the composition of household assets among families in Bangladesh. Only 1% of land holdings belong to women, and among women's non-land assets, 50% is made up of jewelry. This is a common way for poor women to keep savings in South Asia. And it can be an effective saving methods. Jewelry can be sold quickly and allows for consumption, which allows for consumption smoothing. But in a flooding, these valuables can easily be lost. And these types of assets tends to be the first to be sold off in case the family needs extra money. This means that in case of a disaster, a wife's wealth would be the first to be impacted and be impacted more than the husband's wealth. And this would undermine her already disadvantaged position. There hasn't been much studies on these intra-household dynamics of disaster losses. Much is due to a lack of data on asset ownership at the individual level. The same study that presents the asset composition in Bangladesh also looks at drought in Uganda and found that wives' assets are negatively affected by drought, while the husband's assets are largely unaffected. And this is despite that women only own 10% of total household assets. So to go a little bit from bad to worse, disaster also tend to increase gender-based violence. And this was found both due to emergency and post-disaster situations, such as Haiti after the earthquake, as well as in the context of slow onset disasters, such as drought in Tanzania. After having painted a dire picture, we also wanted to highlight some positive sides. Though often unnoticed, more evidence demonstrates women's active role in disaster management. Women often trust and listen more to other women. Their involvement is therefore, and with their involvement in leadership is therefore crucial in disaster management. In the report, we highlight experience from around the world. And one example is in Bangladesh, where involving women in community-based DRM helped close the gender gap in shelter use. And this is believed to have lowered the higher mortality rate among women there. Now, let's move to the role of gender in resilience, and here as in preparedness and coping capacity. On preparedness, evidence tends to suggest that women perceive risks of natural disasters more saliently than men. Although it's not clear from the evidence why this is, it's also not clear if this translates into more preparedness action. The literature points towards other factors. For example, women face lower access to early warning and knowledge of evacuation plans. In the absence of actual data on access to early warning by gender, we looked at access to cell phones, which could be used to obtain warnings. And we find gaps in most regions, in all regions, I'd say. In South Asia, women are 23% less likely than men to own a cell phone. But other factors can also influence access to information, for example, place of work. Education levels also matter, especially women's education. In Thailand, one study found that communities with more educated women were generally better prepared for disasters, an effect not found for male education levels. This indicates that investing in women's education have important spillover effects on the communities they live in. Now let's turn to coping capacity. One key determinant of disaster recovery is access to funds after a disaster. The use of saving system is one of the most common coping mechanisms. As discussed previously, however, women's savings are less protected because of lack of access to bank accounts. This figure shows the gender gap in bank account ownership. As you can see, there are gaps in all regions. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, women are 23% less likely to own a bank account. If you don't have any savings to use to recover from a disaster, but you may have the ability to obtain emergency from another source. This ability is usually a good predictor of the ability to recover from a disaster. This figure here looks at the share of men and women that would be able to obtain a significant amount of funds in case of an emergency. As you can see, in all the regions, men are more likely to be able to obtain emergency funds. So let's conclude something that is well understood in the literature, but perhaps not so much in practice. And this is that men and women, boys and girls inside of the same households are affected differently from disasters. This indicates that losses and impact captured at the household level are not necessarily indicative of what the long-term outcomes of a disaster could be for the members of that household. The way we collect damage and loss data from households should be reviewed to make sure that we account for this. We have an overview of data gaps in DRM in the report, and I refer to that section for more information. Understanding drivers of gender differences in disaster impact is an opportunity for policy design, since it can make projects better and obtain better results. We created a policy matrix following adequate timing of interventions before, during, and after the disaster. And all the actions are linked to the categories in our framework, in the structure of the report. And this is what you see here is just a segment of it. These are some general policy action that could be considered to mitigate the gender differences in disaster impacts. The dots indicate whether a local assessment is needed before implementing the policy. If they don't have the dots, it's more of like a general guidance that should be applied everywhere. So I will let you explore this table in more detail in the report. So let's switch to the final slide. Salam. So next step, where relevant and possible, we should try to move beyond anecdotal evidence to understand the global and regional trends in this topic. And we have a few activities moving forward that is trying to do that. We also identified that DRM lags behind other sectors in doing rigorous impact evaluations. So we have some catching up to do. And this would help us understand what works and doesn't for different population groups. There's also an opportunity to leverage new data and technology, such as mobility data, to explore topics such as gendered evacuation patterns after disasters. Finally, we need to support teams on the ground who are preparing gender gap assessments, surveys, designing projects and results framework, etc. Some priorities there includes making data and analytics available to them and support them so that assessments are done in a consistent way. So that's the end of my presentation. I really look forward to continuing this work and also to answer your questions and see your reactions to this report. Thank you so much. So I see that Marianne is connected now, so I will leave the word back to her.
Thank you, Alvina. And I really need to apologize. There seems to have been a mix-up in my calendar, and it showed this as starting at 9:30. So I'm very sorry. No problem. So Alvina, may I assume you introduced yourself, or should I introduce you?
Oh, actually, I didn't introduce myself.
So I might as well introduce you. So Alvina Erman is an economist who works in the analytics team of GFER, and where she works on social resilience using a mixed method, as you probably have gathered by now. So Alvina, first of all, thank you for an excellent presentation. I think it's such a good reminder that we, as you said in your concluding remark, we really have to be very careful of anecdotal evidence, and it's a fantastic reminder that simple diagnostics can backfire. I myself always had this idea that women were much more likely to die in disasters, and as you show, it's a much more complex situation. And it's also a good reminder for complex role and nature of gender dynamics and the importance of really paying attention, careful attention to that, and how it interacts with the economic situation of households. I think you do have, though, a very clear message on this idea that there's really a clear link between faring worse in disasters and the economic disadvantage that unfortunately characterizes the situation of many women. It's a gendered situation. So thanks very much. Really, really enjoyed the presentation. Now we're going to have our panelists. So the first one is Claudia Soto, who is a DRM specialist in LAC, who's led and contributed to a number of DRM and urban operations in LAC, including Haiti. So I'm sure she has lots of relevant experience from that, and West Africa, and who's really tried to bring in some of the new innovative methods on remote sensing and so on and so forth to the table. So Claudia, over to you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Marianne. Thank you, Alvina. I don't know if we can present my PowerPoint. Is it Said? Yes. Thank you so much. So good morning. My name is Claudia Soto, and I'm a DRM specialist in the LAC region. So I will present the experience of Haiti in integrating gender aspects in the DRM program. So for context, Haiti is located in the Caribbean and is highly exposed to hurricanes, floods, and earthquakes. And it's also the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere and the only FCV country in the LAC region. Women are the backbone of Haitian society and local economy. Nearly half of Haitian households are actually women-led. However, women and girls are still very much affected by severe socioeconomic inequalities and gender-based violence. And given these inequalities, women and children are disproportionately affected by disasters in Haiti. So in the next slide, in this slide, I will show how the IDA Finance Strengthening DRM and Climate Resilience Project has integrated gender consideration in its design. So this project was approved by the board in 2019, and it aims to improve early warning and emergency evacuation capacity and also strengthen the provision and access to emergency evacuation shelters to save lives. And so as a first step during preparation, we worked with the government to conduct a gender gap analysis and better understand what were the constraints faced by women with regard to emergency evacuation, and the following elements helped inform the gender gap. So we conducted a behavioral study with the Mind Behavior and Development Unit at the bank, a shelter design study with MIT and Harvard, which was actually developed before, but we used the recommendations of the study, and also consultations with the government, given the data gap in the country, and also the World Bank gender strategy. Next slide, please. So the following two slides will show how the recommendations of these studies and consultations helped inform the design of 4 activities of the project. The first one is an innovative knowledge campaign for the 2020 hurricane season with a positive preparedness message. More than 4 million people were reached with clear and improved messages through music, SMS, radio podcasts, robocalls, and visuals in the most at-risk, remote, and marginalized areas. Women were given high visibility in the campaign and also were benefited by this campaign, as many of them are illiterate, and all of this material was able to reach them. Can you come back to the previous slide? Sorry. And the second activity that's what benefited from the gender consideration is the inclusion of gender and GBV considerations in the specialized training given to the 140 municipal civil protection committees who are in charge of disseminating alerts, evacuating population to shelters, and managing the shelters. Next slide, please. The third activity is the design and construction of gender-sensitive emergency shelters with appropriate basic services and resources, such as water, sanitation, lighting, and menstrual hygiene resources. This was one of the big constraints faced by women for not wanting to go to a shelter, and also shelters that have separate areas for women and children and easily accessible infrastructure for women and family. And finally, improved shelter management procedures for more safety of women. As mentioned earlier by Albina, there's a lot of GBV risk in post-disaster situations. So women are very reticent to go to shelters because of sexual aggression risk. So in the project, we integrated GBV mitigation measures in shelter management procedures. And also, we included a requirement that half of the shelters built, that at least half of the shelters built in the project are led by a woman during the evacuation process. So to close with the last slide, thank you. We have learned through the Haiti experience that integrating gender considerations in the design is critical to ensure effectiveness and impact of interventions. And to summarize, I have four important lessons that I can share with you. So the first one is that we need to understand disaster risk in conjunction with the understanding of the role of women in society, the FCV context, and also the gender gap in the DRM sector. The second lesson is to focus on women not only as beneficiaries, but also as participants in the design and implementation of activities, and also when possible, to include women as leaders in activities. The third lesson is to leverage innovation and technology, given the capacity constraints of the Haiti context and also the lack of data on gender. And the fourth and final recommendation is to strengthen the capacity of national and local institutions to better understand the gender gap, tailor activities in the DRM projects accordingly to better serve women. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Very interesting example from Haiti. Now we will have Jana El-Hor, who's a senior social development specialist in the Africa region, where she works on gender, social inclusion, and FCV, and where she has designed and led a number of CDD projects across both in Africa, but also I think in South Asia. So go ahead, Jana.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And also let me congratulate the team on a very good report. I really enjoyed listening to the presentation, and I think this would be a great resource actually moving forward to bring in these, looking more at the gendered impacts in disaster risk management. So thank you very much for inviting me as well to be part of this launch today. So let me take you now to Madagascar, and we're going to focus on this project called Miunjo, which is the support for resilient livelihoods in southern Madagascar. I would like, can we move to the next slide, Salam, please? Thank you very much. I wanted to, before we go directly into southern Madagascar, just to let you a little bit know about like Madagascar as an overall is one of the most poorest countries in the world, with the poverty incidence above 65% of the whole population. So we're talking really about very impoverished conditions. This project focuses specifically on the south of Madagascar. So what I would like to give you now is just a little bit of a glance on southern Madagascar specifically, just so you understand where this project fit within a broader context and what we have been trying to do. Thank you, Salam. So because I didn't want to come and show you the whole map of the country and you can see the whole vulnerability in the whole country and wonder why we're only working on southern Madagascar, because the country faces different types of climate shocks. And actually, we're talking here about years and years of multiple climate shocks. And so we're looking more at resilience rather than just looking at DRM specifically. But if we zone in on the southern Madagascar, it's a population of 2.5 million, but it's also been a very lagging region with minimal government support. In the country, it's known to be the cemetery of projects, so there hasn't been any long-term development intervention in the south. In the south, the poverty incidence is 90% compared to 60% in the rest of the country, but 90% is pretty high. So we can say that everyone is poor in the south, below poor even. It's extreme poverty, if we can. We in the country, we talk about extreme poverty in southern Madagascar, but it's more than extreme as well. One of the characteristics in the south is this increased drought and climate shocks. So within this context, this lagging context and the lack of government presence, there has been every 2 to 3 years, there's another climate shock that weakens more and more the capability of all population to actually recover from it and adapt to the next shock. So one shock after another has really, really weakened the fabric or the resilience of people to cope, adapt, and recover. Also, because of this lack of development in the south, there's a real exclusion. Besides being lagging, it's excluded from the rest of the country. So there's no infrastructure, no roads. To just cross 60 kilometers, it takes you 4 hours by car, just because of there are no roads. There's no transportation, easy transportation. And within that, now we have a context of increasing and rising insecurity. And so whether it's violence against women, gangs of violence, trafficking of cattle, women, and gemstones. So it's a very, it's a multi-layered, I would say, vulnerabilities that exist in the southern Madagascar. So the project that we had prepared was more of an SD and a sustainable development response to all these vulnerabilities. It's not only a DRM response. This has been prepared by the Social Sustainability and Inclusion GP, supported by the Water GP, the Urban and DRM GP, the Agriculture GP, and the Environment GP. So has been more of an SD approach to a multi-layered problem. Can we move to the next one, Salam? Great. So the project objective is actually, I put it right there, just because it's more of an looking more at improving access to basic infrastructure and livelihood opportunities, strengthening local governance, and having a focus on women and youth. And this will be a first project, part of more of a series of projects where the World Bank is committing to a long-term development approach in a region that has been more affected by where only humanitarian actors have existed. Okay. So now that I gave you the background, now I want to bring us now to actually the topic of our conversation today. What are the key design features? Because now I spoke more about the macro context. What we've learned from the different assessments we've done, and we can talk more about those in the question and answers, but what we learned that the multiple and repetitive shocks have weakened women and youth resilience to shocks. What Alvina had mentioned is, she said that in certain situations, men are impacted differently, women are impacted differently. For us, based on all our assessment, the recovery and the resilience of men was a lot stronger than the resilience and recovery of women and youth. It's stronger in relative terms, but women and youth have had much, much lower resilience to recover and cope, and they've had different impacts by these shocks. And so we can talk about those more specifically, but women have been taken away from leadership positions, have been more victims to GBV violence, have not been able to sustain their livelihood opportunities, while youth have taken up more into participating into gang violence, leaving their communities to be part more of crime activities, not participating in legitimate livelihood activities, and being sanctioned out from their communities. So you see, the impacts have been different. And this is why we wanted to make sure that the design features and the project will fit in these different impacts that women and youth have gone through. So these are some of the things that we have put in the design following the World Bank gender strategy. So looking at more leadership, voice and agency, and supporting activities for that, looking at social empowerment, mentorship and leadership programs, providing support for survivors of violence, and strengthening GBV health services on the local ground. And also, more importantly, thinking of livelihood programs more following the graduation model. We can talk about more specifically about that later on as well in the question and answers. But I wanted you to know about the fact that livelihoods program they're not thinking about them as a cookie cutter approach, but more of an accompanying approach to these different populations, segments of the population. Can we move? Yes, thank you, Salam. Also, as you see, climate change is a cross-cutting issue for us.
Jannah,
yes.
I'm just going to ask you to maybe start wrapping up, so there is time for
this is I need 30 seconds. So climate change is a cross-cutting also priority for us, because we're looking at it not as one shock, but repetitive shocks. So we have also within that, we have included key design features. What is important is that the climate change as a cross-cutting priority, we want it to be shared by the whole population. So any kind of communication campaign, infrastructure, energy efficient infrastructure, or any kind of type of planning is more community-based. And then we have interventions in the project that are specific to certain vulnerabilities that exist in the community. With this, these are main features of the project. I hope we can discuss more during the question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jana and Claudia. So please, colleagues, feel free to put your questions in the chat. I have a few for the team, for the speakers, but if you could use the chat or raise your hand if you prefer to speak. So the first question I would like to ask both Jana and Claudia is, both of you have carried out these gender-informed assessments. And I wonder if in just a few minutes you could tell us what you found were the challenges and opportunities, but also give us a sense of how, what kind of action you took to address the gaps that were identified in the assessment. So Claudia, you want to start, and then we'll ask.
Yes, thank you for the question. So we did conduct various studies, and to be very honest, they weren't gender studies. They were the technical studies that you usually do during preparation. So we did a behavioral study on emergency evacuation barriers to identify why people wouldn't evacuate. We did also a architectural design study for shelters to identify what were the most appropriate options for infrastructure design. And also we looked at the gender strategy of the bank, which is the only basically gender document that we have had available, and various consultations with the government. And from those, we kind of had the opportunity to see the gender differences emerge from the technical studies, but we didn't go in saying, oh, we're going to do the gender gap study. And probably that's a challenge for us teams that are preparing projects, is that there isn't a very well-established gender framework or gender gap framework in operations. I know there is a gender gap methodology, but there isn't a very well-established methodology for us to address the gender gap very upfront, to really inform the design of activities and target the beneficiaries, the women beneficiaries. So in summary, I think we were lucky that these gender aspects came out of project preparation, and I think in the future it would be good that teams have the resources in terms of expertise and also methodology to take that a bit further into a more structured approach.
Jana, you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, Marianne. So I would say we as we were preparing the project, our first step was to conduct some consultations on the ground. And we, based on these different consultations, as we went to different areas in the South, we realized a couple of things. One is you cannot just do a quantitative study because data does not exist. We only had census data at that point. But at the same time, just from going to different areas, we realized that there are different answers we're hearing from women, from young people, from the leaders. And so we wanted to match our census data with some more qualitative data to be done. So we went for actually a mixed method study, looking more at the informal networks that exist in southern Madagascar, and looking more specifically at networks of women, networks of elderly, networks of youth, and how they have coped with different shocks. And so looking at more what they have done for recovery and what is their strength of resilience. It took us quite some time, and this is why I encourage teams for when they do some of those consultations and they see some questions that are important to seek some trust fund money. We were lucky to get trust fund money from GFTRR for the study, because we wanted to really have some rigorous analytics that underpin the project, and really looking at the gender impact. Are really more men dying? Are really more women dying? What are the impacts? What are the gendered impacts, rather than saying these people are more impacted, or this population is more impacted? And so we used mixed method, basically, to look at these coping strategies of the different vulnerable population that we have identified throughout through the census, but also through different consultations. And what we did is, based on those coping strategies, we can't, and based on the resilience, we can't really address all the vulnerabilities, and so we had to make some selections for our project. But what we have learned, and I would say maybe like two main things, is that looking at, for example, one thing that is very important for us, it's very important to, if we were going to work on the gender dimensions of the project, to work with the whole community. It's not only working with women. We need to really address not only thinking about livelihoods for women, but we really need to think about the social norms, and we need to think about women participation in the communities. We cannot work on the south of Madagascar without working with youth. This is the biggest issue that we have, and we need to think about not only helping them be economically sufficient, but how do we reintegrate them away from their illicit activities. And that's how the analysis helped us come up with these key features, design features that we have included in the project. Thank you.
Thank you. And linked to that last point, Jana, there's an interesting question there from Olivia Forsberg of CEDA, who's asking if either one of you have applied any gender transformative approaches, such as addressing the role of masculinity in the DRM project. From what I heard from both of you, you were much more targeted towards, the physical aspects and then women's immediate needs, but maybe I missed something.
So for us, in Madagascar, this is definitely one key pillar of a lot of the social empowerment work that we're doing with young people. We have dedicated, since I would say more, it's not a DRM project per se. I would say it's more of a project helping transition communities from humanitarian assistance to in DRM situation to more like sustained development. And so if we're thinking about it from this nexus, for us, the priority was that we need to work on the issues of masculinity among the young population. What we've learned from our assessments is that young people are not only joining gangs for economic gains, but also they're joining gangs for images of masculinity and feeling more important in their society. And so doing a project that just help them work on a road maintenance where they make money every 2 weeks is not going to be sufficient for them. We needed to really work on doing some mentorship work, doing some academy just for these young people, thinking about role modeling, connecting them with the elderly in the communities, doing mediation sessions between the young people and the community for them to be reintegrated and accepted, to think about how to make them really, one thing that we're trying to do is how to make them also decision makers in the communities. Like, how do we strengthen civil youth associations in the community to make decisions with the elderly, with the women, and give them more voice and agency that they have opted out to go to other to illicit activities to get that. So we have a whole component just on that. And we're looking at the social dimensions for youth and for women. And I would say in all of the projects, we're looking at youth and women equally, because we see them as two different vulnerable groups that have been impacted differently. And if we're talking about sustainable development, both of them will need to have their immediate needs and thinking more about their social integration more thoroughly in the project. Thank you.
And when you say youth, you mean male youth primarily, right?
We're looking at male youth, but also we're looking at young girls. It's because we're dividing it also separately, because the other issue that we have also found in our assessments is that while young like boys ages of 12 to 16, they go and participate in the illicit activities. Young girls, for purposes of feeling more important and for status, young girls would seek to get pregnant and become mothers because that's also how they reach their status in their own community. And so we're working a lot with GBV services that we're providing. We're providing sex and health education. We're providing more mentoring with young girls about the risks of early pregnancies. And these programs have shown to have positive impact from other donors. And so we're trying to repeat the same package of programs that are being given to girls in terms of like the social empowerment modules that we're offering.
Thank you. And now over to you, Claudia. And if you could also address the other question we got about gender sensitive architectural design. So the question was whether there's a manual, some guidance for that. And that links back to the point you were making that, you felt there was no gender gap methodology, but is there gender informed architectural design that you were able to draw on?
So the preparation of the project revealed that there wasn't any, so there is a shelter design guideline, and it's pretty old, and it gives very functional guidelines on how the shelters should be built and arranged, but it's not an architectural guide. So we're working with the government through the project to come up with prototypes or designs for shelters that are going to be replicated at the country level, and that integrate these gender considerations. So we're in the process of working with the government on that. They've hired an architectural firm to do the designs, and just to link up also with the rest of the presentation, the community involvement is very important. So there are committees set up at the municipal level to work with the architectural firm and to give also women opportunity to voice their needs in the process of the design of the shelters. And I think the other question was about the methodology to address the gender gap. Is that right? Yes. So I think the bank is doing a lot of efforts into giving visibility to gender aspects, and I think I'm a big believer in that, and I'm very excited to work on gender and DRM. But in the practical level, when you are the TTL, you are the task team, and you have to do this work with the government, it's very hard to find very applicable operational guidelines on how to integrate, do the gender gap and integrate gender considerations in projects. So it's a creative process. It's a long process. I think just to come back to the male reinforcing masculinity, we weren't able to work on this in this project, and that's something that I regret. But in the next project that we worked in the unit in Haiti on urban development, that's something that was also incorporated. So it's a long process, and I think it's an iterative process as well. And the government also needs to build awareness. And it's not something that is built very quickly. So I think we have a lot more we can do a lot more. And we're just excited for the bank to also give us resources, expertise that we can bring to the clients in the government and see how to work with them to improve all of these analytics and projects as we go forward.
So maybe a quick question to Alvina on this. Well, also plug, I know that some years ago when we started developing the crime prevention programs in LAC, we came up with, we designed a manual on crime prevention through environmental design, which a lot of which was, making sure that you don't create structures that offer opportunity for rape, aggression, and so on and so forth. So I imagine you're probably tapping from this. But Alvina, a question for you. Is this, this kind of architectural designs and manuals, is this something that you're working on, or that the report refers to as a follow-up?
Well, I mean, I think that what I highlighted as part of next steps, I do think that we're creating something practical, like taking this very kind of high level overview that we've done now in identifying drivers and identifying different gaps, both on the terms of analytics. I think the next step will be to really dig into the operational side and come up with some guidelines, but there are a lot of different guidelines. I think that would be needed. I mean, there's huge challenges in the way that we collect data. So I think that there's immense, a lot of thinking that is needed to be done to be able to, like, how do we balance this additional cost in getting more detailed data with the urgent needs of a post-disaster situation? How do we collect the data? It's not always straightforward. So in terms of the shelter design, we haven't come to that part yet, but it's definitely something that is identified as an important aspect in the report, and it identified as a gap. But it's also identified as something that where we are making progress. I think Claudia's project is part of this, where we are building shelters where we are considering gender more prominently. So I think that's something that should be a fairly low-hanging fruit in terms of, okay, so can we just do this always, like just globally, like whenever we're rebuilding like a post-disaster emergency project, like let's make sure that we're thinking about these things when we're rebuilding schools and adding a floor for an emergency shelter, or depending on the context. So I think it's definitely something that if it's not there, then we should think about that.
So, and Albina, while I have you, why don't you give us a sense quickly of how you expect teams to use this report? I mean, you seem to suggest that this is just a first start, out of which a whole work program will be developed. But is there something to be integrated in a practical way right away? Are there like key takeaways?
Yes. No, I think that what projects that are starting out, I think I'm referring to DRM in the report, in disaster risk management, and I'm using the broadest possible definition of disaster risk management. I'm thinking about work in an environment where there's vulnerability to disaster, which is it's very, very broad, and you have to think about the way that the social interacts with climate vulnerability. So a lot of projects could benefit, or a lot of sectors could benefit from looking at the results of this report. So I think it will be a report that you could go back for to look at. Okay, so I'm doing work in scalable social protection. It's a public works program. Where do I fit into this? What are the things I can think about, for example, what would be the effects of removing adults from the family farm in terms of the impact of educate school enrollment for boys. This is like one of the findings that I brought up in my report. Like that could be a potential negative effect of scalable public works program, and how do I ensure that you don't have that effect, or at least consider it as part of the design. So it is very broad, and I think you can go. I think a lot of projects, with the Claudia probably starting out, like, okay, so what are the evidence, and you start doing the same overview over what's there, what do you find in different contexts. Now we've created this compilation of evidence, and we've also created a framework. So like, okay, so I'm thinking about impact. So what are the different impacts and what are the drivers? I'm thinking about resilience, preparedness, and what is the existing evidence there? You might not find a lot, but at least you find some guidance on, this is what's out there, and this is how they looked at it. And these are some data sources where I can go and see what's the value in my country, because we are referring to a few global data sets in there. But I mean, it's more of like a point of referral for teams that want to get started, and hopefully the framework can guide people so that we're doing more or less the same thing or thinking about it in a similar way when we're designing the assessments. It might not be the full thing, but it might be a part of it, and we can start to consolidate and make these assessments more consistent. And I think that we all would benefit from it when compiling all of the different assessments.
So maybe to go back to Gianna and Claudia, so and there's an interesting comment by Ilaria Gallo from WMO in the chat, who says, look, you know, there's lots of analysis that shows that in many cases, women's resilience was weakened by the DRM projects rather than increased, right? So Gianna and Claudia, based on your experience, based on what you now know is available, you know, from this report and other things, what would be your sort of lessons learned or keywords of wisdom for other TTLs as they're going forward to make sure that, you know, first of all, we do no harm, but second of all, that our projects really contribute to increasing women's resilience? So I wonder if you have a few nuggets you might want to share. Claudia, you want to start?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. I think there is very little, at least in the countries that I've worked in, there was very little capacity to understand gender gaps and design gender actions, and even less to understand the gender impacts of projects. So the first thing would be to really try to find ways to either strengthen capacity of government to look at also what are the impacts and how do we monitor that. Or also work with third parties. We work with various NGOs in Haiti that have expertise in gender and GBV to help the government kind of monitor, collect data, and also address issues of gender, especially for GBV. We've included GBV grievance mechanisms, not only in terms of the management of the shelter, but also in terms of the construction of the shelter. How do we make sure that during the construction, women and girls are not at risk of GBV? So one, it's the capacity, building capacity to really mitigate risk. And the second one, and that's more of a project management issue, is that the gender aspects are usually kind of looked at the end when the project is already designed. And just because you get an email from the gender tag team or the CMU who says, is your project gender tagged? And then you start panicking. And so that's not the way to go about it. And I think the gender discussion should probably come before even starting or during the very first steps of the design process. And I'm currently working on the preparation of a project in West Africa. And it's the very, very first steps of the preparation. And I already reached out to the gender team. I think they are connected here. To really look at the gender very, very upfront, so that we have not only the best design, but also the best impact, and also capacity to assess what are the impacts. And then it would be very unfortunate that the impacts are negative. I haven't been in a situation like that in one of my projects, and I understand that's a risk, but that's something that really needs to be analyzed and discussed very early within the bank and also with the government, of course.
Gianna, what about you?
Thank you, Marianne. When we were designing the project, so we basically, during our different assessments and consultations, we realized that even through our emergency responses that the World Bank has been designing, there has been some mixed impacts. Whether it's like you're giving cash and you're increasing the power of the female household after a shock, but also you're giving it to one household versus another one while they're both very poor. But through our own targeting criteria, we identified that this household X should get the cash and household Y should not get the cash. So we had created I would say, inadvertently also a context where we could have not only had adverse impact in our own project, but probably the long-term impact of it created some communal tensions as well. So when we were designing the projects, there were 4 questions, because we were an SDA team. I always had 4 questions that I always pushed the team to always rethink. And the design of the project kept changing and changing and changing to fit in all the activities and ensuring financing for these things that we wanted to have to ensure positive impact and ensure that we are continuing to target women and youth. And the 4 questions were always, and the team would tell you that, so who are we designing this for? So every time we spoke about basic infrastructure, livelihood program, who are we designing this for? Who's going to benefit from this? So if we do a typical livelihood program, is it only men? Is it only women? Is it young boys are going to benefit with this? So we always played scenarios of implementation. Who are we designing this for? And then the second question, will they benefit from it over the long run? So what do they need for sustainability so we can ensure that this is included in the design? The third question was, what prevent them from accessing these activities? And we always went like, we used to divide it even by like water user associations, small farmers, female headed household, like, because we had the big team, so we had to discuss. And then how do we change the design to address these barriers? And until the decision meeting and even after, we always redesigned and rethought about that, because I didn't want us to, again, present a design of a project that looked sound on the infrastructure or on the type of livelihoods that we're providing, but we're not looking into consideration at these gendered impacts that we had that we discussed at length, but also that we had found in our assessment. That how do we look at those gendered impact and we design the necessary activities to address them, rather than just saying this is what should be a typical response for such a situation. So thank you.
Thank you. And we have a question for Joaquin. Joaquin, do you want to come in? Because I'm not sure I completely understand your question. So your question is something about integrating this issue with multi-hazard. I think you're referring maybe to some of those school things. Are you on?
Yes. So, sorry, I had issues with the internet and I was caught in the middle of the question. But the question is you know, we were talking about guidance and all of that, and several of them on how to build shelters. We started how to build shelters for hurricanes, for example, in the Caribbean or in Haiti. Then now how we integrate that with COVID, and now the considerations on gender. I feel, and Alvina mentioned this, we have too many guidance and how we put all this together and make sure that we don't duplicate or we don't do something and then next year we have to do something else. No, so I think the challenge is in being aware of these issues beforehand. No, and fortunately, I think in the DRM we tend to think in multi-hazard approaches, but rather than just one hazard or one issue. So I wonder if you had some experiences on this to guide what will be the future.
Excellent question. Who wants to come in of our 3 speakers?
Yeah, I can just quickly react to it. So, I mean, I think that the gender aspect definitely doesn't have to be like a separate guidance. You know, this is really about thinking about, like, just having it in whatever practical best practices that exist, that this is part of it. I think especially if you're working in a challenging and data poor environment and you're already facing challenges in understanding the basic issues, gender has a tendency to take the back seat. Because you're like, okay, so I need to figure out the basics, and you might not even think about the fact that so let's see if there are any different. Let's sit down with women in a separate room, or let's include a couple of extra questions in our questionnaire on a member level. I think it's really about integrating it into the guidelines that we're already working with. And I think it's interesting what we learned from Claudia's presentation about, okay, so they were doing technical studies that would have been done anyways. But because somebody in that team thought about considering the gender aspect of the technical studies, they managed to find the evidence that they found, and that was used to convince the client to take a more proactive approach. So I don't think necessarily it is much like a lot of more guidance, more work. It's more about having somebody there that have read something on it and that will consider it as part of the work that will already be done anyways.
So, and this is over to Claudia and Jana. I mean, Jana, I really liked your approach of having, your master questions, right? Because maybe what we need in these frameworks is less a set of answers than a set of filter questions. Would that sort of, what do you think?
So I completely agree with you, because I didn't want us to have I didn't want the team to think about the gender tag and think, oh, this is a box that we need to tick. And as we all know, the gender tag is really not a box, it's a design feature, how we think about the gender considerations. So I work on gender as well. And usually when I think about a filter on gender, I always think about questions. I don't think about must-have. And those were, and because I was literally working with like 4 other engineers. So I had to translate what we wanted to do into questions. And I have to say that the work really was great. The team was fantastic about thinking about these questions and how do we change the design and do the work accordingly. And they were all shocked when actually the project was gender tagged, because we didn't think about, oh, what are we doing on the gender tag? We actually thought through the questions. I made sure that our results framework was all divided, gender disaggregated. So we're having a whole storyline about gender. And when I say gender disaggregated, it was disaggregated by women, by young girls and boys. And so we looked at it from that perspective to have a strong storyline that actually also loops back to all the assessments that we've done early on.
Claudia, you want to come in on this as well?
Yes, just to support what Albina said, it's very, I don't want to say it's easy, but it's a very small extra step to add a gender optic or consideration in the TOR that you are helping the government to work in, or in the study that you're conducting, in the questionnaire that you're using for the community consultation. As you said, something very easy, doing consultations separate with women. That's marginally zero cost to you. It's super important. So those are the things that we included in the project preparation, and that are very very easy to add. But you need somebody to think about through those things, right? And I'm not a gender expert, and I was lucky to very upfront think, I need to bring somebody in the team who is going to be looking, who's going to be kind of the champion of the gender agenda in this project, and she was very good with the client too. So I would recommend anybody who's working in a project, especially in infrastructure, to have somebody, having a dialogue with the group of engineers to look at those things as well. And in terms of duplicating investments, we in Haiti since it's a very resource limited environment, so we are working on multifunctional shelters that are used during the year on other things, so that also adds a layer of complexity. So we're working on community infrastructure to be used as shelters, also on schools to be used as shelters. I know this is a very contentious topic, but in Haiti, where infrastructure, there's a huge deficit of infrastructure, you cannot afford to just have a shelter. There's just going to be a shelter used between June and November. So that adds a layer of complexity, and we're really looking at finding innovative approach to using these multifunctional infrastructure with the mobile adaptive features, so that you don't have to build a separate room for women if you don't need it. You can, add a mobile wall that you can separate spaces as needed, so you don't duplicate or do unnecessary investments. That's one thing. And the other thing is a lot of the gender aspects are behavioral and are soft. And so you don't, I would say, it doesn't have much of an impact also on the infrastructure. Of course, having appropriate lighting, putting the bathroom in the right spot is important, but there's also a lot of awareness, of training that you have to do with the people, having the right guidelines, having the right leadership to manage the shelters. And I would think that's also as important as the infrastructure. And again, that's not as expensive to do and to implement.
So I think this is another good reminder of, bringing our gender and climate specialists at the beginning, right? When you're still asking the questions. I think that would be great. So we got an interesting link to the Women's Resilience and Disaster Knowledge Hub of UN Women. So I encourage everybody to look at the chat. By the way, there's some really interesting suggestions. And we're told by Victoria that this framework is going to be tested in 3 countries in Africa. So I think that's great. I wonder, Joaquin, does this answer your question? Or you think we need to do more on this issue of, multi-hazard? The bank does have sometimes a tendency to pile on one requirement upon another. And we're not very good at just rethinking the whole thing and sort of making sure everything's well integrated, right? We tend to just pile one thing on top of the other. So Joaquin, I wonder if you want to come in on this, or Alvina, if you have suggestions in the sense of how GFDR is going to contribute to make sure that we don't just make ourselves heavier and heavier, particularly because, as both Jana and Claudia mentioned, it's really not about doing that. It's really just about asking the right questions and being intensely pragmatic.
Maybe, Marianne, just to jump on here, I think I believe we need to be very pragmatic and very operational on this, no? And having these questions asked very much at the beginning. We know that, especially, for example, in Haiti or in the Caribbean, we had health issues before COVID. We know that we will have earthquakes, and we know all these risks. However, the flavor of the year is hurricanes, or it's earthquakes, or it's volcanic eruptions, or now it's pandemic. And I feel that somehow we are pressured by the moment and not looking this holistic. It will cost us a little bit more, but a little bit more if we have a comprehensive approach from the very beginning. And I think sometimes we are pressured to deliver projects to, a little bit more of the study will take a little more longer. And I feel in the instances that we have been successful, it was an approach of a decision to do these things right, no? And I think having the tools to make the things right and not spending so much time on looking for the guidance or creating guidance will help us to do this very comprehensive. And I think we are in the right approach, because from what I see, gender is here to stay. No, now we are incorporating these issues from the very beginning of our projects, and is successful, and we can see the results of these very early in the project. So I think we are in the right path on this issue, at least from our side.
So Alvina, what about you? And also, if you could pick up one question that I had missed earlier, which is bringing gender consideration not just to the building of shelter, etc., but to overall reconstruction, right? As we're building back better, which, you know, typically we try to build back stronger, are we also building back in a way that reduces vulnerability of women? Is there considerations of that?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, no, I mean, the idea with this work, and I mean, I do think that the bank is doing great stuff on gender and DRM, and I think it's you know it's, but yeah, but I think also, you know, it I must have pressed a button. So I do think that teams are facing challenges also in doing this gender assessment. So this work is not to put a stick in the wheel, it's to support teams, right? So it really is about making data available and thinking about it in a strategic way, holistic way, as you're mentioning, Joaquin. And also, I think it's great that you're connected to this talk today. So thank you. So I hope that it's that it's clear from this discussion that it's really about that, right? Like thinking about it holistically, thinking how it fits into the bigger picture, thinking about how it can be used in a way to improve results of the overall project and improve results and improve in projects for all. So, and if the experience so far has been positive, that's great, and I think, you know, that's an incentive to keep going and keep making it easier and easier for projects to implement these considerations into their projects. So I think we're definitely on the same page. In terms of the building back better, we highlight a few aspects of it. I think that the cyclone, you know, the reconstruction, including gender consideration in shelter, in reconstructing schools and adding a shelter in the school and making it consider gender aspect of that is part of the building back better and making the situation better for women. Another aspect that we looked at is on the tenure situation. So we have a few examples where reconstruction projects, housing reconstruction projects, have taking advantage sort of improving the tenure situation for women. So when they're given the option of reconstructing their house, they're also reviewing the tenure and trying to add the wife to the title, or adding both if they're on title when the disaster happens. So that's also an example of where you can improve gender equality through a disaster reconstruction project. And I think I think that's, I mean, we have a few examples just from the matrix. I suggest that people go in and kind of look at the policy matrix, and we have a few just after the disaster, a few recommendations of how projects can use that situation as an opportunity to kind of rebuild better, just to improve the situation for women or you know, whoever's disadvantaged.
Thank you very much, Alvina. I think we have to wrap up, but I did want to flag a comment that Stefan just made in the chat, which I think is really relevant, which is this idea of it's not just gender that should inform DRM, but DRM that should inform the work that we do on gender. No, I think if I understand your point, Stefan, correctly, you know, if we really can highlight some of the key sources of vulnerability in DRM of women, that can absolutely inform the broader sets of information, of interventions, you know, financial inclusion and other ones. I think that's an excellent lens that then feeds into all our work on poverty and so on and so forth. So, so thank you very much to all of you. This was a fascinating event. And again, my apology for joining late, but fortunately I didn't miss too much. Excellent presentation, wonderful work, Alvina, and to you too, Jana and Claudia, absolutely fabulous work you're doing in the field. So thank you all for sharing, and thanks to all the participants for their comments and suggestions in the chat.